I'm Maria Lane, professor of geography and environmental studies.
How long have you been here at the university?
I came in 2006, so it's my 18th year.
And how did you arrive here? What was your trajectory arriving to UNM?
So I did master's and PhD at University of Texas at Austin, and then came here. And I first was a PTI, actually. When I arrived, I just was teaching a couple courses per semester. And then the first year that I was here, there was 2 searches because the department had gotten pretty small. The dean authorized a couple searches, and I decided to apply, even though I thought I was only going to be here for a few years. I thought, this is a good place. I feel like it's a good fit for me, and decided to apply for one of those positions, and here we are.
Can you talk about your journey into, your sort of scholarship in historical geography and its kind of focus on environmental justice and conditions?
Yeah, so I had a really circuitous path to where I am now. My undergrad degree was in Latin American studies, and I was mostly interested in Latin American politics and government and history. And after I graduated, this was at the University of Virginia, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked for the Organization of American States, which is a hemispheric humanitarian organization, kind of like the UN, but for the Americas. And in that organization, I was working on a regional development and environment project. That was the name of the department. And I worked on this natural hazards project. And I just got really interested in environmental planning and decided that that was something I wanted to go back to school for. So I worked at OAS fairly briefly, and then ended up taking a job in a planning firm, and went to grad school to do planning, went to do a master's in environmental planning. And while I was at UT, I took a lot of courses in geography that were really like theoretical, kind of the history of knowledge, how we think about environment. And then I got really interested in that at the same time that I was still interested in like planning the practical applications of this knowledge. But I just really decided to dive in on some of these questions about why do we think about environments the way that we do? How do we understand what's true about environments? And then how do we integrate that into our planning and our policy? So I did that. The PhD in geography really focused on environmental claims making and the history of that, like intellectual history of that. And so that's where I am in geography. I consider myself a historical geographer, but I'm mostly focused on what's the different kinds of environmental and geographical knowledge that's being wielded and negotiated at different times and in different places. And most recently, my interest in community geography has really emerged from that scholarly interest in how is it that we prioritize different people's knowledge over others, and even different forms of knowledge and different ideas about what knowledge is. So that's the long path of how I got from being just interested in Central American history to today working with local communities on environmental knowledge.
Can you talk a little bit more about, as you teach and do your scholarship in the region, can you speak a little bit more of the kind of specificity of that kind of work?
Yeah, so one of the classes I inherited upon arrival here at UNM was Geography of New Mexico and the Southwest. And I just felt so lucky that that got assigned to me because it was a way to get to know this region, which I'm not from. I'm from South Florida, and totally different biome, totally different, political history, et cetera. And so the class really helped me get to know this region, and it also informed some of my research interests. I had done a book on the mapping of Mars and the original ideas about what the landscape of Mars was like as projected by astronomers. And I essentially translated that really quickly to the New Mexico context of thinking about a different arid landscape, a different irrigated landscape, because a lot of those early projections about Mars were based in a belief that it was inhabited and that it was irrigated. And so that translated pretty quickly to New Mexico. So I've really dived in on the water histories of New Mexico and the water policy and management decision making. I've just published a book last year, Fluid Geographies, which looks at the history of water policy in New Mexico during the transition period where we went from community-based water management to a centralized state-level policy, and tried to really understand that in detail, like what was happening, whose knowledge was being prioritized in that shift, and who was winning and losing when these different contests were happening over what policy would be. So again, it comes a lot from that original 18 years ago engagement with trying to understand what is this new place where I live and how can I understand it and understand my role in it as a recent arrival without centuries worth of ancestry and heritage to pull from and understand.
I know that you've worked with some of the Acequia groups here in the state. Can you talk a little bit about, how you work with communities and think about co-production of knowledge and what does that entail in terms of your scholarship and your teaching?
Yeah, so as part of my scholarly thinking about knowledge contests and knowledge claims and how these get worked out through power relations, I got interested in what are the possibilities for how we might do something differently just in our role, like my role, my individual role as a faculty member at UNM. What can I do differently to account for power relations? This became like an intellectual question for me that I had to ask, like, how do we translate this into action? And so we came up with this idea with a donor who was really interested in supporting us and supporting our work in geography, that we would start a center for community geography and take a really different approach to the normal R1 faculty approach to teaching and to research, that we would try to set up the center so that we could have a little bit of funding for students who could help us and to support classes that would engage community questions. And so this is like a completely new arena for me to say, instead of I'm going to come up with something I'm interested in, pursue it, or I'm going to do all this research and then present it to students in a class, to say, what questions does this community group want answered? And then how can we possibly translate that into a class project or a research project and make the timelines work and have it be done in one semester, and like all these kind of nuts and bolts questions that are pretty complicated when you try it. So we started the Center for Community Geography with small amounts of funding, but thinking about how do we make the biggest impact with these small dollars. And we started doing quite a bit with a class that we have called Critical Cartography. So we're a geography department. We teach all these classes about mapping, technical classes, methods classes. You take all of our classes, you're well qualified for a mapping and GIS job, right? But we wanted we created this new class that would be kind of a meeting point for people who have or want the technical skills and folks who are really interested in these critical questions of power and knowledge. And so the class that we built is built entirely around community-based questions. So instructing that class, I would then be reaching out to groups, including like one project that we worked on was in the South Valley here, neighbor of Albuquerque. The Pajarito Acequia Neighborhood Association was mobilizing and wanting to kind of think about what that a psych system meant to their community and how they could build community around it, and like what infrastructure did they need to protect it, but also what communication did they need to engage in. And so that was one of, many projects that we worked on in this class, where we asked them to take the lead on like, what do you want us to do that we could help you with? And then I, as instructor, had to do this thing I'd never done before, which, like I said, is to translate that into like, okay, how can the students still learn what they need to learn about theories of maps and knowledge and power, as well as some practical skills in mapping that's responsive to community needs, and make sure that that learning aligns with what the community needs. So students in those classes over the years have done, activities that you wouldn't do in a normal classroom class. They're out there tabling at events, they're out there meeting with community members, they're doing surveys, they're doing interviews, they're walking ditches, they're, taking a GPS and getting a location of every single tiny little head gate on every individual property, because that's what the community said they needed. And maybe that's not something that's going to feed into a research project or a research question that I have or that you have, but it's something that allowed us to be helpful to the community at the same time that the students are learning about some of these complexities and some of the technical aspects of mapping.
That's a wonderful center that you have. Maybe in terms of thinking about community engagement holistically at the institution, do you have any thoughts or visions for what the institution could do better in terms of community engagement?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. Um, it's a real challenge to take community need and have it intersect with like groundbreaking research, which everyone at an R1 is supposedly working toward. And I guess I just still wrestle with why why is that such a challenge? Like, why isn't it that every time we answer a community question or need, we're not performing at the highest level of research? You know what I mean? So I think there's a lot of this translation that we need to do, in terms of, maybe it's not translation, it's really matchmaking, like taking the needs that are identified outside the institution and then matchmaking them with the learning needs and the research needs that we have inside the institution and putting those together. I think we could do better with that. Like if we had like a matchmaking system or a matchmaking person, like maybe this would be easier for individual faculty who want to engage in it. I think, you know, establishing some partnerships that where the community partners always know that we're going to be working for them, whether it's an engineering class or a geography class or an education class, and being able to create the structures that support that, I think is something that we could do better. But also just incentivizing it in the right ways. You know, faculty are very responsive to incentives, as our students, we incentivize with grades. And if we could incentivize in the right ways, through our faculty reward systems, I think people would have less need or feeling like I need to go do this research in Indonesia because the cutting edge research is about forest change and that's where forest change is happening. So I need to go there to do my R1 level research. I mean, can we incentivize staying here? Not that we have to be totally provincial, but like, can we incentivize staying here and doing the really good advanced research here that needs to be done? I think that's a question we have to answer at the institutional level, and that's a place we could do better. Not that I have the answers to how exactly we do this, but that's where I think those are the growth areas to be a truly community engaged institution.
More recently, you took on a new leadership position here at the institution. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing now?
Sure. So I'm now the Dean of Graduate Studies, which is our central office that supports and oversees all graduate students across campus. With some exceptions, we don't oversee all of the professional programs. in health sciences, for example, and School of Law and Anderson School of Management manage some of their own affairs. But for most of the grad students on campus, we are the ones who help track your academic path, make sure you meet all the requirements so that you can get to graduation. We provide student support services, and we're trying to do more work working with the individual graduate programs to make sure that they have the resources that they need to support their own students in-house. Because in grad programs, of course, where the rubber really meets the road is in the individual programs. That's where admissions decisions have to be made. That's where student research has to be supported. So we can't support every student individually through a centralized office, but we can really kind of push resources out to the program. So that's something that I'm very interested in.
In terms of just the institution, I think we're very unique at the state of New Mexico in terms of how we're positioned as an R1 and also our reach. Is there something that you might advocate to a student coming to the University of New Mexico and maybe the uniqueness of this place?
I mean, I can't say enough to prospective grad students about what an incredible place University of New Mexico is. I mean, any R1 that you go to is going to have tremendous resources. And so whatever your field is, biomedical engineering, yeah, you're going to have the resources that you need, but you're going to be also in this large cohort of grad students across disciplines who also have good resources and high ambitions, etc. What you're getting at University of New Mexico is seeing where that intersects with the mission, the undergrad mission of this institution, which is this really broad service of not leaving anybody out and providing a good R1 quality education to everyone, regardless of your preparation. And there's tremendous challenges that go with that. And as a grad student, to see those challenges and have a chance to process them as a research assistant who might be working with undergrads in the lab, as a teaching assistant where you're engaging directly with a population that maybe you haven't seen because you came from the East Coast or you came from University of Texas like I did. This is really, it's a tremendous opportunity to develop some skills specifically, but that's the really important part of this, is developing a philosophy and an ethic of thinking about how do you reach the highest levels in terms of your research while not leaving anybody out. And that's what I think is really, really special.
This will be our last question. You mentioned about traveling to China this summer. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails and what you'll be presenting on?
Yeah, so I have never been to China, mainland China. I've been to Taiwan a long time ago for a research trip. But I'm going to be going to the International Conference of Historical Geographers, which is a really great conference that I'm involved with. It happens every 3 years. And so we'll be meeting in Shanghai this summer in July. And I'll be presenting on my book, Fluid Geographies, and talking about this is really a growth area in historical geography, is really looking at settler colonialism in more detail and kind of tracing out colonial impacts through knowledge, claims, policy that gets instituted, management practice, et cetera. And so that's kind of the core of my book, looking at the New Mexico context, but really thinking more broadly about what is settler colonialism and what's the work that it does and how can we think about like the details of it. If we really understand the details of it, then we can think about how do we get past this in terms of getting to the next political phase. I'm Maria Lane, professor of geography and environmental studies.